Well, it's lovely to be with you this evening. I know we've got a group of international students with us. I'm delighted that you're with us. So I'm going to try and speak nice and slowly so that you can all understand exactly what I'm saying this evening. I'd like to start by asking all of us here a question. What do you really think God is like? What do you really think God is like? Perhaps you think there's a God at all. Some of us here this evening may think that God is a bit like that kindly old grandfather figure that cartoons have, sitting on a cloud, nice but completely irrelevant. Some of us may think there perhaps isn't just one God, there are many gods, a bit like the ancient Greek or Roman civilizations. I'm sure many of us can remember the publicity around Richard Dawkins and others who decided to advertise things on London buses back in 2009. And one paper reported the campaign with these words. A controversial advertising campaign featuring the slogan, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life," was launched today on Britain's trains and buses. And it goes on to say the £140,000 campaign will be plastered across 200 bendy buses in London and 600 across England, Scotland and Wales. That was 3 years ago. Probably no God. Interesting, I don't know whether you read this in the newspapers recently, that Richard Dawkins, in a recent debate with the Archbishop of Canterbury at Oxford University, said he was not an atheist. Did you read this newspaper? He said that he was actually an agnostic. See, an atheist is someone who's certain there's no God, and an agnostic is someone who's not really sure. In response to that, and if you see the video of this on video or YouTube, you see that the audience take a deep breath when he says, "I'm not an atheist." In response to this, Dr. Rowan Williams suggests that Professor Dawkins is often described as the most famous atheist. And the truth is that implies, not what do you look like? I like this one, God, what do you smell like? Do you exist? Are you real? And as we get going this evening, I want to ask us this question. How do you know anything about anyone? You may have come here this evening with a friend or a family member. How do you know anything about them? Well, you observe their behaviour, don't you? You listen to them. You see what they do. But how do you find out what really makes them tick? How do you find out what's really going on in their hearts and in their minds? Well, the answer is very, very simply, they have to tell you. They have to reveal their heart and their mind condition to you. Because even as human beings, we're quite good at hiding what's really going on inside, aren't we? We need to reveal to people what's going on. One of the questions that we received back on the survey said this: why are there so many deluded people who believe in the existence of God? Now, in response to that question, I'd like to answer it by saying this. As Christians, we believe in something called revelation. Put very simply, that is, we believe that God reveals himself to the world. He reveals himself to humanity. He shows just what he's like. In the same way that I may reveal myself, my heart, my desires, my mind to other people, God has revealed himself. Now, how does God do that? How does a God, if there is a God, reveal himself to us? Well, we've got some friends who live in the country, and they've got a great home. It's one of those homes you'd see in Home and Country, one of those lovely magazine homes. They live in a converted barn with fields all around them. They've done lots of work on the property whilst they've been living there. You can see the extensions they've added and the paper they put up and the way they've changed things. And occasionally they'll say to us, "Will you house sit for us just for a few days while we go away?" Now, I have to say, it's not a very difficult decision to say yes, because it's such a lovely home to stay in. And when you get there, you do find out a little bit about their character from the home that they designed and changed, the things they've added and built on. At some level, their home reveals their thinking. Now, in a book in the Bible called Psalms, the writer says this. It's from Psalm 19. "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they use no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the end of the world. You see, Christians believe that in part, creation itself reveals to us the fact that there is a God. Lots of you have probably seen the Bupa advert on TV, and you'd probably like to be part of Bupa. I'd like to be part of Bupa, but I'm not. Can you remember the slogan for the Bupa adverts? They go something like this: "You're amazing." Now, just take us down from the creation of the whole of the universe, just down to us as individuals. Just think about how complex we are. Think about the 50, the 60 trillion cells that make us up. Think about the 70,000 miles of blood vessels and capillaries that fit into one body. Absolutely amazing. Most scientists nowadays agree that the universe, that creation itself had a beginning, that it was created out of nothing, and yet, having been created out of nothing, it is so vast, it is so beautiful, it is so complex, that it points to there being a God. I'd like to read to you a quote from a very clever chap called John Lennox. This book and his new book is available in the bookstore, so I encourage you to read people like this. He is currently Professor in Mathematics at the University of Oxford. And in conclusion to one of his first books, the title was God's Undertaker, Has Science Buried God? In conclusion, as he looked at the evidence, as he looked at creation, as he looked at the enormity of humanity, he says this: "In conclusion, I submit that far from science having buried God, not only do the results of science point towards his existence, but the scientific enterprise itself is validated by his existence. Inevitably, of course, not only those of us who do science, but all of us have to choose the presupposition with which we start. There are not many options, essentially just two. Either human intelligence ultimately owes its origin to mindless matter, or there is a creator." He goes on, "It is strange that some people claim that it is their intelligence that leads them to prefer the first to the second." He says very, very simply, there's a choice. Either everything is an accident and there's no purpose, there's no meaning, or there is a creator that created things with a purpose and a meaning. Later in the week, we'll look at the challenge and often personal problem of suffering. The Christian worldview is that the universe, the world, even our bodies, the relationships in which we live, they're no longer perfect in the way that God intended. And that's something we'll deal with later on. But even in its fallen condition, the glory of the universe, the glory of humanity, the glory of creation points to there being a God. So as Christians, we believe that the universe reveals in part God to us, the fact that there's a creator. I'd like to take you back to my friend's house now. Whenever we go to stay there, they leave notes all over the place. The notes say things like this: help yourself to what's in the fridge. It's normally mouldy vegetables. They say things like the bed linen can be found in such and such a place. They often leave great long instructions about how to look after their pets. You see, the house reveals something about them, but the notes that they leave behind also reveal something about them, often their generosity. In a book in the Bible called the Second Letter of Timothy, we read these very simple words, that all Scripture is God-breathed. You see, as Christians, we believe that the Bible is actually God, in a sense, exhaling his words, speaking out his words. As I read the notes that are around my friend's house, I find out more about my friends. As I read the Bible, I find out more about God and his plans, his desires, his purposes. But the best way to get to know my friends is by simply spending time with them, having dinner with them, laughing with them, talking with them, sharing with them. The best way is actually to meet them personally. Back to the survey. some of the other questions that we were asked. Would it be easier to believe if God's physical presence could be seen on earth today? If you're real, why don't you show yourself? Do you know, if I could travel back in time, that would be a great thing to be able to do, wouldn't it? If I could travel back in time and go to first century Israel, I would be able to go and hear Jesus speak. I would be able to sit on the mountainside, if I could find the right mountain, where he gave the Sermon on the Mount. I would actually be able to see him, and if I could get close enough through the crowds, I would actually be able to touch him, and possibly even speak to him. You see, history confirms that Jesus really lived. And in John's Gospel, a man called Philip, a follower of Jesus, he asked this question. He says, Jesus, show us what God is like. Show us what the Father is like. And Jesus says this. He says something remarkable. He says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. In other words, he says, if you look at me, you see what God is like. And Christians believe that in Jesus, God gives the most complete and detailed revelation of what he's like. Jesus, as someone once said, is God with skin on. And although we can't travel back in time, we can read about Jesus in the Gospels. And all of you on your seats have got a Mark's Gospel. And if you haven't got one of those at home, just encourage you to pick it up and take it home at the end of the evening. Because in that Gospel you can read about Jesus, who says, when you see me, you see what God is like. And for those of you who are sceptical about the reliability, the accuracy of the Gospels, there is far more evidence in their support than you may even begin to realise. Once again, the books at the back encourage us to think about some of these issues, why we trust what the Gospels say, what the New Testament says about Jesus. A very important man, Sir Frederick Kenyon, who was former director and principal librarian of the British Museum, so he knew about books. He stated after a discussion about the reliability of the New Testament, he stated this: both the authenticity and the general integrity of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. I think this is a really important issue to think about, and once again encourage you to look at the bookstall. All sorts of books that help us understand why we can trust what is written in Scripture. So Christians believe that creation, Christians believe that the Bible, and ultimately Christians believe that Jesus shows us what God is like. You've seen Jesus, you've seen what God is like. So let me ask you a few questions as we keep going. If Jesus really is God with skin on, if God really did come down to earth in Jesus, what would you expect him to be like? What type of things do you think would upset him? What type of things do you think would delight him? What type of things do you think would concern him? When confronted with injustice and suffering, what do you think God would do if he was really on earth? But in the remainder of my time, I want to just look at what Jesus was like when he was on earth, when he was confronted with all of those things. And I want to think about three aspects of Jesus. The first one is his character. This morning I had a phone call from a company. They said, we need a reference for someone now. They've applied for a job, and the job starts on Friday, if they get it. Can you give us a character reference now? So they ask, how long have you known the candidate? How do you think they'll work in a team? How do you think they'll accept authority? How do they cope under pressure? And you give a very quick character reference. And you can't help but think it's form-filling, because they could have been talking to the dog for all they know. You put the phone down and they're happy. But character references are important. The character of someone is significant. As we read the Bible, as we listen to the people that spent time with Jesus, what type of character reference do we get about Jesus? Well, Peter, who travelled and lived with Jesus for 3 years, that is long enough to find out what someone's really like, isn't it? 3 years, day and night, 3 years. Do you know what Peter said about the character of Jesus? He said this: Jesus committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. Find that in 1 Peter. To be honest, you probably wouldn't be able to say that about me if you spent 3 days with me, let alone 3 years. And as we look at the character that's painted of Jesus in Scripture, we see that he welcomed the outcast, he welcomed the broken, he was gentle with the weak, and he challenged the arrogant and the self-confident. You see, his character was beautiful, most beautiful man that has ever lived. And as he died on the cross, the Roman centurion who stood at his feet and saw the way that he died and the words of love that he spoke from the cross, the Roman centurion said this: "Truly this was the Son of God." As you read the Gospels, you see that Jesus had an impeccable character. You'd expect that of God, wouldn't you? You'd expect God to have an impeccable character. Jesus also spoke with authority. This is the second thing about Christ. He spoke with a power and a clarity. In Mark's Gospel, after Jesus has been speaking to the crowd look at each other and they say, "Who is this man? He speaks with such power. He speaks with such authority." And if you read the teaching of Jesus, it is remarkable. He spoke about revolutionary standards of love and forgiveness. He spoke against injustice and hypocrisy. The Sermon on the Mount is the most famous sermon that has ever been preached. But being God, he also spoke with challenge and clarity about the eternal realities of heaven and hell. Much of modern politics, one commentator suggested, is do and say anything to win a vote. Do you know what? Jesus never tried to win a popular vote. He knew that his message was too important to be tarnished by playing politics. He spoke with honesty and integrity and authority that changed the world. So as we think about Jesus, the great revelation, his character, his words, finally his actions. When Jesus was on earth, we get a glimpse of what a perfect universe was like. And as Christians, we believe that we get a glimpse of what the new heaven and the new earth will be like. You see, as a loving God, when he was confronted with the death of his friend, Lazarus, Jesus weeps bitterly. When he sees suffering and sadness, when he sees death, it breaks his heart. But then he shows his godness by raising Lazarus to life again. When confronted with sickness and suffering, he healed and restored countless numbers of people. He performed miracle after miracle. When confronted with a hungry crowd, he showed he is creator by feeding thousands with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. When a storm threatened to sink the boat he and his friends were in, he simply spoke to the wind and the waves, and they were still. And as the boat stopped rocking, the friends exclaimed, "Surely this is God." But you might say to me, you don't really believe Jesus did those miraculous things, do you? Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say, "Come on, God, show yourself," and then when he does, and does God-like things, say, "Well, actually, we don't believe in miracles." Christians believe the universe, the Bible, Jesus shows us what God is like. And Christians believe that as we look at Jesus, his character, his words, and his actions prove that he is God. Now, as I close, one last question from the sermon. Why do you care so much that you came to live among us? This is the heart of the good news of Jesus to a broken and a damaged world. My time is nearly gone, but I'd like to leave you with the most, or possibly the most famous verse in the whole of Scripture. It's John 3:16. God loved the world so very, very much that he gave his only Son. Because he did that, everyone who believes in him will not lose his life, but will live forever. This verse contains themes that we'll return to later on in the week, but it's a verse that points us to the cross where Jesus died. The cross where Jesus demonstrated his complete love for a broken and a fallen world. And Christians believe that it is because of the cross of Jesus that we can be restored to a relationship with God himself. It's because of the cross we can know God's mercy, forgiveness, today and forever. So in response to the question, what is God like? The answer is, he's just like Jesus. He's not the toothless grandfather in the sky. He's not like this, he's not like that. He's entirely and exactly like Jesus. That's the God that we believe in as Christians. and encourage you to look at the bookstall and encourage you to pick up the Gospels on your seats. Thank you.